Good afternoon, students. In today's session, we will discuss formulation of research problem and identification of research problem. But before starting this session, we need to understand and we need to be clear about how to define research problem. What is research problem? So it is important to define the term research problem. Selecting and defining a research problem is the first and foremost step in a research process. Selecting and defining a research problem is the first and foremost step in a research process. This is the first and basic step in the process of research. A researcher must try to find the problem and properly define it so that it becomes susceptible to research. A researcher must try to find the problem and properly define it so that it becomes susceptible to research work. So, to define a problem correctly, a researcher must be clear with what a problem is, how to define it, and if a problem is not well defined, it will lead to some faulty or undesirable result. And finally, in a wrong direction, which will not be of any use, not for a researcher and not for any purpose. So it is said that a problem well defined is problem half solved. So, right from the first step, a researcher needs to have clarity about this. So, it is said that a problem well defined is problem half solved. So, it should be well defined, properly defined. So, defining a research problem is a kind of prelude to the end one hopes to achieve, and therefore it requires careful, considerable thought and analysis. Thorough analysis. So, what is research problem? In general, a research problem refers to some kind of difficulty that a researcher experiences in the context of either a theoretical or a practical situation and then wants to obtain a solution for it. It refers to some kind of difficulty that a researcher experiences in the context of either a theoretical or practical situation and then wants to obtain a solution for it. The individual or the organization can be said to have the problem only if an individual has no idea about the best course of action. The individual or any organization can be said to have the problem only if they have no idea about the best course of action, best plan of action about something. So, an individual or a group of persons can be said to have a problem which can be technically described as a research problem. If they, having one or more desired outcomes, are confronted with two or more course of actions that have some but not equal efficiency for the desired objectives and are in doubt about which course of action is the best. So, a research problem is one wherein a researcher is required to find out the best solution for a given problem. What is a research problem? Research problem is one wherein a researcher is required to find out the best solution for a given problem. That is, to find out the best course of action. That is, to find out the best course of action, the objective can be attained optimally in a given situation. There are possibly several factors which may result in making the problem more complicated. For example, the environment of situation. They can make the problem a little more complicated or can affect it. So the environment or situation itself may change, affecting the efficiency of the course of action or the values of the outcomes. The number of alternative course of action may vary. Persons not involved in making the decision may be affected and not react to it favorably or even unfavorably, and related other factors. All such elements may be thought of it in context of a research problem. Identification of a research problem or selecting the research problem. The research problem which a researcher is going to select or which a researcher is going to identify or he is going to undertake for a study must be selected with utmost care. The task of selecting a problem is the most difficult one, although it may not appear to be so. You may feel it is nothing in it selecting a problem, identifying a problem. There are so many things which can be studied, but honestly, it is a very important task which needs to be selected, which as a researcher needs to select with utmost care, because you are going to complete it, you are going to carry out a work which will be with you for some time, for next some time, for some years even. So you have to be careful with it at every step. You have to be careful at every step. So utmost care needs to be taken by the researcher. Every researcher must find his own level of salvation for research problem, as it cannot be borrowed. It is clear, obviously, it can be borrowed. So, must find his own level of salvation for research problem, as it is not something that you can borrow from others. You yourself need to identify, you yourself have to carry out this work. So, you have to be very careful with it at every step. A problem must come out from the researcher's own mind, own insight, own experience, own analytical thinking. So it must come out from researcher's own mind. You should identify. You should not do it because others are doing or they are telling you to do so. You should feel about it. Okay, this needs to be studied. It needs to be studied, or some issue that must be addressed in the field of education. So a research guide should be the only help a researcher. Their work should be to help a researcher in identifying or selecting an appropriate problem. So research guide should be the only help a researcher should expert in choosing a research problem. Still, some points may be taken care of while selecting a research problem. Some points may be taken care of while selecting a research problem, which I am going to discuss with you one by one. Any subject, any topic, any work which is overdone or already a lot of work is done should not be normally chosen. If it is some exceptional case, then it is other thing. Otherwise, it should not be chosen without any specific purpose, as it may lead to repetition and moreover nothing new will come out of it. So it will lead to mere repetition and moreover it will be a difficult task to throw any new light in such a case. So to avoid repetition, subject should be something where there is some scope for work, no repetition. Too narrow, next is too narrow or too vague problems should be avoided. Neither it should be too narrow or too vague. It should be avoided. Both will create problem for for the researcher. So neither narrow nor too vague. The selected subject or problem for research should be familiar and feasible, so that the related research material or sources of research are within one's reach. Remember, selected subject or problem for the research should be familiar and feasible. Both. It should be familiar and it should be feasible, so that the related research material or source of research it should be familiar and feasible, so that the related research material or sources of research are within one's reach. The importance of the subject, the qualifications, and the training of a researcher, total cost involved, time factor, are few other criteria that must be considered or that must also be considered in selecting a problem. In other words, before the final selection of a problem is done, a researcher must have answers to the following questions. Whether he is well equipped in terms of his competency to carry out the research, whether the study falls within the budget a researcher can afford, whether he or she can obtain the necessary cooperation from those who must participate in research as respondent or subjects. That's why we were talking about feasibility. So they are the main concern, whether he is well equipped in terms of competency, whether the study falls within the budget, whether it is affordable or not for a researcher, whether they can obtain the necessary cooperation from those who must participate in research as respondents or subjects. So, if the answers to all the questions are in the affirmative, one may become sure as for the practicability of the study concerned. And the last thing, the researcher must conduct a preliminary study before selection of a research problem. The researcher must conduct a preliminary study before selection of a or before going further. It is not necessary when the problem requires the conduct of a research closely similar to one that has already been done. But when the field of inquiry is relatively new, remember when the field of inquiry is relatively new and does not have available set of well developed techniques, a brief feasibility of study must be undertaken. In the area of research, if the area of research is selected properly, carefully, by keeping into mind points like I discussed, the researcher will not go in wrong direction, and hopefully it will yield fruitful results. The subject or the problem selected must have complete involvement of the researcher and must have a priority in his mind for the research, so that the researcher may undertake all the pains needed for the study. Necessity of defining the problem. I will discuss in my next session necessity of defining a problem.